All right, so multicellularity obviously came after unicellularity, or single-cell organisms. Okay? So, like I said, in this lesson we're going to talk a little bit about how evolution and creationism are not the mortal enemies that everyone seems to think they are. Okay? In fact, you guys are quite fortunate in that you have a very forward-thinking Pope. Okay? Anyone know what Pope Francis's educational background is? Besides theology, obviously. He's a chemist. Okay? He has a degree in chemistry. He's a scientist on top of being a theologian. Okay? So his background is science. And in fact, he's not alone. A lot of very prominent religious people throughout history have been scientists. Okay? And they've had very strong beliefs in both the theology of our church as well as scientific endeavors. So, Pope Francis came out and said, one of his earliest things that he said when he became Pope was, the church really has no problem with the idea of evolution. People think we do for some reason, but there's absolutely no conflict between what it says in the Bible and what Darwin discovered to be true. Okay? Darwin discovered that over time, a mechanism called natural selection can cause changes in the appearance, structures, and behaviors of an entire species, to the point where that species is no longer recognizable as the original. Okay? That's the idea of evolution. Okay? Now, natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution happens. Okay? Natural selection is nature selecting certain genetic traits as superior to others. Okay? And what we mean by superior is this. If an organism's genetic makeup gives it traits that make it better suited to its environment, it will reproduce more often than one that is less suited to its environment. All right? So I think the example I gave you the other day was if I'm a wolf and I'm born with incredibly keen eyesight and really strong muscles, I will probably capture more food for myself and as a result be stronger than a wolf with, let's say, less superior genes. Okay, maybe a nearsighted wolf. You can imagine a wolf that would need glasses. Okay, obviously that would be detrimental. Okay, if I was a wolf and I couldn't see well, how would I be able to capture food? Well, I probably wouldn't. I would probably be weak. Okay, maybe so weak that I don't even survive to the age where I could produce offspring. Okay, or I might not be able to get a mate or something like that. Okay, which means in the end, my genes, which were inferior, will not get passed on. Okay, that's how natural selection works. Okay, it's kind of a cold process, but it's a logical process as well. And it ensures that organisms adapt to changes in their environment. Okay, that adaptation is evolution. That's the change over time that a species undergoes. Okay, that sort of makes sense to everybody? Okay, so that's the process. Now, for years and years and years, people said, well, there's no way the church can agree with that because the church says that God created everything and it's perfect the way it is. Okay? Which Pope Francis said, well, that's ridiculous. There's no way that the church thinks that. The church knows better than that. There's scientific evidence out there that says that's not, that everything was perfect the way God made it originally. It's not. Okay? And then people will say to him, well, but the Bible says that the earth was created in 6 days. And to which Pope Francis said, have you ever heard of a metaphor? Okay? Have you ever heard of that? And basically it was, you have to understand the time at which the Bible was written. Most people at that time were illiterate. They couldn't read. They only understood what people told them through stories. Okay? That's why Jesus taught in parables all the time. Okay? He always taught people by telling them these stories that were relevant to them, things they understood, in terms they understood, and experiences that they had had, because that was more meaningful. So, knowing that a week was a sacred amount of time for the Jewish people, it made sense to make an analogy, okay, to a week when talking about the creation of the earth. Because if you, at the time the Bible was written, went out and said, so the earth, it's like 4.5 billion years old. And when it first formed, it was all these rocks in space that crashed into one another. And they formed this molten ball, which over the course of 1 billion years cooled down. And then liquid water condensed in the atmosphere and fell as rain and further cooled and collected as oceans and blah, blah, blah. People would have looked at you and went, there's an aura of crazy around that man. And we're going to throw rocks at him until he's dead. That's stoning, by the way. It was a common way that they would kill heretics back in the day. Okay? That's what would have happened to you if you'd have tried to explain the way Earth really was made, okay, back in the time the Bible was written. People would not have accepted that. They had no understanding of those concepts. Okay? So it was easier and more logical to say, look, over the course of these days, here's what happened. It's not really that it was 6 days, it was that here's the order in which things happen. And the order in which the Bible describes things is the same as the order in which science describes things. Okay? Separate light from dark. Big Bang. Probably pretty bright. Okay? Separate the oceans and the land from the sky, the oceans from the land. All that stuff, that all happened in the same order, okay, scientifically speaking, as it happens in the Bible. Okay? One of the last things to appear was us. Okay? Evolutionarily speaking, we are pretty much the last thing, okay, that was really new that appeared on Earth. Okay? And still people kind of argue that, oh no, the Bible can't say that that's the way it was. It said 6 days, and you know, if people can't get past that, then there's no reasoning with them either. Okay? But the big idea here that Pope Francis was trying to say was the church accepts that when God made the earth, that wasn't final. He knew the earth was going to change. He knew things were going to happen. He knew there was going to be a process through which the earth would develop and change. He wanted to put life on this thing that he had made, but he didn't want it to die. So he had to give it the ability to change. He had to give it the ability to adapt. That mechanism is natural selection. Okay? So when it comes right down to it, okay, Darwin discovered it. God invented it. Okay? He came up with this idea to ensure that the life he put on this earth would be able to grow and thrive and adapt to the changes the earth would throw at it. He knew his creation wasn't going to be static. It was going to be very dynamic. It was going to change, and things would have to adapt to that change. And so he gave them a mechanism through which to adapt. All right? So that's why evolution and creationism, what you learn in religion class, is not at odds, okay, with what science says. They actually agree very, very well. All right? Questions on that? There's a deep one for right before a long weekend. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at multicellularity here. We're going to look at history of the earth, development of the earth, okay, all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to look at how multicellularity evolved, okay, so from single cells to multicelled organisms. Okay, understand the role of, and here's a key word, specialization. Okay, specialization is a key word. Only eukaryotes can become specialized because it has to do with compartmentalization, that thing we talked about before. Okay. A few of you had the opportunity yesterday when you were done looking at the cells that you looked at a few other slides. Okay, some people looked at like the muscle tissue slide, the stomach lining slide. You looked at a bunch of different things. Okay, those are all made up of cells. Every single thing that you looked at there was made up of cells. But did they look alike? They look very different because in our body we have thousands of different types of cells. Okay, they're specialized to do a certain job. And while at their core, they're all basic animal cells, they do have some very obvious and important structural differences. That's what specialization is. Some cells in our body do one job very well, and other jobs, eh. Okay? A cell can still always carry out all the basic functions of an organism, but it's not going to do them all really well. It's going to do one really well. Okay, because that's what it's specialized to do. And then it depends on other cells in the body for the other stuff. Okay, remember how we said it's interdependent? Okay, that's what we're talking about. All right, so nerve cells are really good at transmitting nerve impulses. They're really bad at digesting food. Okay, in fact, they basically don't do it. They rely on the circulatory system to bring that to them. okay, to bring sugars in the blood, okay, that they can just absorb and send to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria can burn for energy. Okay? Because a nerve cell is not specialized, not designed to digest large food particles. Okay? Whereas cells in your stomach are. Okay? Cells in your small intestine are designed to absorb those particles and get them into the bloodstream. Okay? Everything is designed to do something a little differently because they're specialized for a certain job. Okay? An amoeba, which is a single-celled organism, that cell has to do everything. Okay? It isn't specialized to do anything. It's generalized to do everything because it's a single-cell organism. As soon as you become multicellular, you will have specialized cells to do a certain job. Okay? So being specialized is the key characteristic of a multicellular organism. Okay? If you are multicellular, you have this. All right, and then we're going to look at a plant as an example of a multicellular organism with specialized cells and tissues. Okay, we don't dissect anything in Science 10. Okay, we will be doing a lab next week. Okay, where we're going to examine how a plant transports water, and to do that, we'll cut up a plant. That will be the extent of our dissecting in Science 10. So if you're not comfortable with dissections, don't worry. You don't have to dissect anything in this course. Okay, you get to Bio 20, you do. You do the fetal pig in 30, I think. So that'll be the first time you have to dissect something with a face. Okay? So if that bothers you, know that that does come up in biology, but not in science. All right. So multicellularity actually evolved several times, several different times, okay, during the Earth's history. Okay? Some of those groups or branches of the tree of life are still growing, and some of them have gone extinct. But basically, the groups of multicellular organisms that have evolved and have remained alive are animals, plants, and fungi. Okay? Those are our three groups, three kingdoms of multicellular organisms. Okay? Now, basically, a multicellular organism just is, okay, where some type of basic cell changed so that it kind of grew in colonies, and then those colonies eventually became multicellular organisms, okay, when specialization started to kind of develop. All right. So here's the brief history of Earth, okay, from the very beginning to the present. All right. Now what you see here at the very start is this thin blue line, okay? The thin blue line here represents the diversity of life on Earth. And by diversity, I mean the number of different types of organisms. Not the number of organisms, the number of different types of organisms. That's what diversity means. Okay? So obviously very early on, there really even shouldn't be a blue line here. Okay? So 4.6 billion years ago or so, okay, the Earth is a molten ball of rock that has been aggregating, okay, for probably around, maybe a billion years, half a billion years, somewhere in there. Okay, stuff has just been smashing together, okay, to form the Earth. Right? Each time it smashes together, some of the stuff that's in it vaporizes. That gas starts to collect around the Earth. The Earth has enough gravity to hold it there. A primitive atmosphere starts to develop. Okay, that kind of stuff starts to go on. Okay, it's also around this time, okay, that a cataclysmic event happens to the Earth that was really important for the development of life. I know that's counterintuitive. Something cataclysmic actually leads to the development of life. Okay, but around this time, Earth was smashed into by a Mars-sized object. Okay, there was a lot of stuff floating around. Okay, at that time. Okay, it wasn't the 8 planets, nice organization we have now. There was a lot of stuff floating around, and around that time, a Mars-sized object smashed into little primitive Earth. Okay, that collision stripped off the outer layer of the Earth. It wasn't a head-on collision, it was kind of a glancing blow. Okay, so what happened was the impactor was essentially absorbed, okay, and the outer layer of the Earth essentially thrown off into a cloud of debris that surrounded the Earth. Okay. That cloud of debris collected and formed what? Oh, didn't form the atmosphere. The moon. Okay? The moon is actually the result of a giant impact with a Mars-sized object early on in Earth's history. Okay? And the reason we know that is because the samples brought back to us from the moon, by the way, we did land on the moon, okay, and did bring stuff back. If you're one of those conspiracy theorists who thinks that was all fake, sorry. We really did that, okay? So they brought back these samples, okay? And what they discovered is that the moon is actually really light for its size. It doesn't have like an iron core like Earth does, okay? But what they've discovered is that the entire moon is made out of the same materials that the surface of the Earth is made out of. And the only way that that could happen is if it came from the Earth, right? It's also exactly the same age, right? Which means they formed at around the same time. Right? So we've got that event happening. Now, the Earth is just starting to cool enough. That takes a long time. After it gets hit by something that big, it's basically just a ball of lava floating around the sun, okay, for a few hundred million years. Okay? It starts to cool. You get that atmosphere forming. As the Earth cools, the atmosphere cools. Vapors that are in the atmosphere condense. They fall as rain. Okay? That further cools the surface of the Earth, and we start getting a planetary kind of ocean forming. Okay? So 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago, in this cooling Earth and these salty seas that we would have had at that time, okay, the first life originates as single-celled organisms. Right? So the Earth was over 1.5 billion years old before the first life happened. Right? So Earth was sterile for over 1 billion years. Okay? Now, when that first life evolves, there's not a lot of competition. Okay? It's like you're the only person in the grocery store. Okay? You've got tons of food. Right? You're not going to starve. You got access to everything you need. Okay? That's what it would have been like for early life. Okay? And that early life would likely have been photosynthetic. Okay? Cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. Right? And it would have covered, okay, like the surface of the ocean. Just would have been mats of this stuff. Okay? So it's starting to carry out photosynthesis. Okay? And as it's doing that, okay, what gas is it putting into the atmosphere? Oxygen. Right? On early Earth, the atmosphere is very different. It's made of like ammonia and carbon dioxide. Okay? It's a very, very different atmosphere. So these cyanobacteria are just pumping out oxygen by tons and tons and tons every day. Okay? Eventually, this actually leads to a mass extinction. You've heard that term before. Okay? So mass extinction happens when basically almost all life on Earth disappears. Okay? The first mass extinction was actually caused by the first living things that lived on Earth. They nearly killed themselves off. Okay? Their waste products, oxygen, which we now take for granted, was toxic. It was a waste product. It's a waste product of photosynthesis. Okay? Those organisms depended on a certain atmospheric composition. And they were putting out so much oxygen that they actually changed the composition of the atmosphere to become oxygen rich, okay? Which at a certain point became toxic to them. Okay? And a whole bunch of them died off. Only the ones that could survive these toxic oxygen levels managed to survive. Okay? And then they continued, and of course their offspring were able to survive that, and so on, and then that's the course of evolution, okay, as we go along. All right, 2.8 to 2.5 billion years ago, okay, we start getting more and more of that oxygen, okay, building up in the atmosphere. The atmospheric composition changes. We start getting an ozone layer, which is now protecting these organisms more from the harmful rays of the sun, okay, and single-celled organisms are becoming more complex. An ice age grips the Earth, okay. Why does an ice age happen? Well, there's still sun. But what greenhouse gas is being eliminated by all these cyanobacteria? Carbon dioxide. They're consuming carbon dioxide at an incredible rate and pumping out oxygen, which has the exact opposite effect on the Earth's temperature. Okay? If you put a whole bunch of oxygen into the Earth's atmosphere, our temperature, global temperature, would drop significantly. Okay? Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Oxygen is not. Okay? And so pumping in huge amounts of oxygen into the atmosphere actually caused an ice age to happen. Okay? And that killed off a few, organisms, a few lots. Okay? All right, about 2.1 to 1.9 billion years ago. Okay? So more than half of the Earth's life has happened already. Okay, at this point. This is when the first multicellular organisms appear. Okay? After 2.5 billion years. Okay, that's when the first multicellular organisms evolved. Now, look at the thickness of this blue line. Okay? Once multicellular organisms appear, what happens to the thickness of the line? It just explodes. Okay? It just absolutely takes off. Now, it doesn't take off really huge until right about here. Okay? In what we call the Cambrian Explosion. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? But as multicellular organisms start to appear, okay, we get a lot more diversity. There's a lot of niches out there that have not been filled. They're available. There's like jobs. Okay? It's like huge. There's no unemployment. Okay? If you're an organism at this time. Okay? There's tons of jobs that need to be done. Okay? And so basically everything is doing well. Right? So we start seeing that diversity starting to blossom, okay? And then right around here, so we're saying multicellular organisms, but we're not saying animals yet, okay? We've got lots of single-celled organisms that are chemoheterotrophs, but we don't have any multicellular animals yet. We have some multicellular plants, okay? Now, we get to about this point, this is where multicellular animals, sponges, appear for the first time. And once that happens, well, if you're an animal at this time and everything else that's alive is a plant, are you going to do okay? Yeah. Okay? And so that's where the Cambrian explosion takes off. There's just suddenly this huge explosion of different kinds of animals. Okay? There's mutations of all kinds. Basically everything is okay. Okay? Everybody can survive. There's not a lot of things that happen that are bad. Okay? And we get this big explosion of life, okay, happening about 500 million years ago. Okay? So in terms of how long animals have been around, not nearly that long. Okay? Not nearly as long as the Earth has been around. So animals are relatively new, okay? Speaking that way. All right, questions on that? I'm never going to test you on when everything appeared. It's just so you kind of understand the timeline a little bit. Okay? Does it take a long time for this process to happen? Yeah. Natural selection happens like that. Evolution, that's something that you don't see over a lifetime. Okay? It's not an organism that changes. It's a species that changes in evolution. And I think that's kind of the thing people don't understand about it. Okay? Natural selection acts on an organism. Evolution acts on a species. Okay? So the whole example with the wolf, right? One wolf, bad eyesight, it dies. One wolf, good eyesight, it survives. It passes on its genes for good eyesight. Eventually, all the wolves have good eyesight. Okay? That's evolution. It wasn't that wolf that evolved. Okay? That wolf was selected, okay? But the species evolves over time. Okay, so what distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells? Okay, so there are organisms out there that are just colonies of single-celled organisms that are bound together for mutual advantage. Okay, that's not a true multicellular organism because every cell in that colony is still doing every job. Okay, you are truly multicellular if there's division of labor. Okay, in other words, specialization. Okay, that word we talked about before. Okay, this organism, not a multicellular organism. Okay, that is a colony of cooperating cells. Okay, every cell in that organism is identical. Okay, nothing is specialized. So every cell there has to collect food. It has to break that food down. It has to process the waste. It has to make hormones. It has to do every single job. Okay, it's not a true multicellular organism. Okay. Questions on that? All right, so evolution caused like increasing complexity. Once there was specialization, that really Okay, so it led to increasing complexity in the organisms, because once specialization came along, now you were able to do each job that needed doing very, very well. And if you're doing a job very well, okay, then you're going to be more efficient. Okay? Being multicellular had huge advantages over being unicellular. Okay? The first advantage was that specialization, being able to do each job very well as opposed to each job sort of okay. Okay? It's kind of like a single-celled organism is a jack of all trades and a master of none. Okay, you guys heard that expression before? So they can do everything, but they're not particularly good at any of it. Okay, so that means, yeah, you get it done, but it's not great. If you're a multicellular organism, okay, you've got one set of cells doing this job. It's all they do it very well. Okay, way better than a single-celled organism does it. Okay, they have this other group of cells doing this other job. It's all they do it very well. Way better than any single-celled organism can do it. Well, that makes them more efficient. Well, is that going to be advantageous in terms of how much food you collect and all of that kind of stuff? It certainly is. Okay? It's going to give you a huge advantage over a competing single-celled organism. Okay? Which means you are going to be selected by nature more often. Okay? And so you're going to change and evolve and become more complex. Okay? And that's what we start seeing. Now, the other advantage of being multicellular is size. If you are multicellular, made up of many cells, you are naturally going to be larger than a single-cell organism. Okay? And in a lot of cases, bigger is better. Okay? If you are bigger, less things try to eat you. Okay? If you're small, anything can eat you. But if you're big, now you got to have something that's bigger or stronger that can eat you. And that's not going to be as many things. So you're not at as big a risk of being a prey item. Okay? So you have that advantage in being multicellular. Okay? You also have an advantage in terms of surface area to volume. Okay? Because as you get big, we said a single cell has a problem. If it gets too big, what process wasn't going to work very well? Starts with a D. Diffusion. Right? Diffusion works as long as cells are small. Okay? If you're a single-celled organism and you get too big, remember we said diffusion's not targeted, and it's quite slow over long distances. So if you're really big and single-celled, you're not transporting materials from place to place in the cell very efficiently. If you're made up of a whole bunch of small cells, you don't have that problem. Every one of your cells is small. Diffusion still works really well. Okay? Maybe you develop some kind of circulatory system like we have, okay, that develops that. Oh, okay. So you might develop some sort of specialized group of cells that's going to transport materials by some active means better than a passive diffusion could do. Okay? These are all the advantages of being multicellular over being unicellular. Okay? All right. So that whole thing with the moon, how the moon formed. Okay? In all these pictures, what do you notice about the moon? It's so close. It's so big. Okay? When the moon did first form, it was really close. It would orbit the Earth 6 times a day. How long does it take the moon to orbit the Earth now? Yeah, 28 days. Okay? The moon's getting further away every day. Okay? 2 centimeters a year. It's further away from the Earth, 2 centimeters a year on average. I know that doesn't seem like much, but remember, it's 4.5 billion years old. Okay? 4.5 billion times 0.02 meters. It adds up. Okay? The moon's getting further and further away all the time. But imagine the effect this had on the Earth when it was really close to it. Okay? What does the moon cause on Earth now? Yeah, tides, right? It pulls, the moon is so big and has so much gravitational pull that it pulls the ocean towards it as it orbits the Earth, or as Earth turns underneath it. Okay? So as Earth turns underneath it, it's always turning another side of the ocean towards the moon, and the moon pulls the ocean because it's fluid towards it. That's what causes the tides. Well, it's doing that at its current distance. Imagine how much the tides changed when it was orbiting the Earth 6 times a day, and how often it happened. Okay? How many of you have ever been to the ocean and you've seen the tides come in and out? Okay? Like, how many people have been to the Bay of Fundy? It's the place in the world that has the biggest tides in Nova Scotia. Okay? The tide can come out several kilometers. It's crazy. Okay? One day I actually walked out with the tide, which was dumb. Don't do that, okay? Because the sandy kind of beach that's left behind, you sink in it. And then when the tide started coming back in, I couldn't walk fast enough to stay ahead of the water. The tide was coming in faster than I could go, so I ended up swimming, okay, by the end of it. So lesson learned there. Okay? But imagine that that's going on 6 times a day. Okay? So the moon is like, you're watching the moon do this in the sky. It'd be crazy, right? We kind of see the moon do this a little bit, but that's not because the moon's moving. That's because the Earth is spinning under the moon. Okay? Imagine Earth is spinning under the moon, and the moon's going like this all around the Earth at the same time. It would be dizzying to watch the moon in the sky. It would rise and set like 20 times a day. It'd be crazy. Okay? So we would have that going on, plus all the gravitational influences of the moon, not just the tides, but the moon can pull on the Earth as well. And remember, the Earth is a lot younger. The crust isn't nearly as thick. Okay? The orbiting moon could have actually caused earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and things like that. It would have a much greater effect on the composition of the atmosphere and oceans and stuff like that.
Does the moon cause tsunamis?
No, tsunamis are usually caused by earthquakes. Yeah. Okay, so underneath the ocean, if you've got tectonic plates, right, and one of them slides under another, what usually happens is, so as one slides under another, it pushes it and kind of crumples it, almost like a car crumples in a crash, except that rock is surprisingly elastic. So as this plate slides under the other, eventually it'll slip. And when it slips, the second plate that's been curling up can snap back like this. And when it does that, it displaces all the water above it. That's what causes the tidal wave. And so earthquakes cause tidal waves, volcanic eruptions, landslides can even cause tidal waves or tsunamis, okay, when they happen. All right, so like I said, a lot more volcanically active. Again, influence of the moon being closer, okay, but obviously the moon is getting further away. The moon, believe it or not, also affects how fast the Earth rotates. Okay? So day length was actually shorter, okay, back then too. So as the moon gets further away, okay, it actually influences how quickly the Earth spins because it's always pulling on the Earth, but it's pulling on the Earth and moving around the Earth, so it kind of accelerates the Earth a little bit. But the further away it goes, okay, the less ability it has to do that. So the Earth is actually slowing down. Okay? Days are getting slightly longer all the time. And I don't mean like the seasonal days are getting longer. I mean like our day is not going to be 24 hours forever. Okay? It's going to be 24.001 hours. Okay? Something like that. It's always going to be changing. Okay? Eventually, the moon will leave. Okay? It'll get far enough away that it'll just kind of fly off, and Earth will become tidally locked. Okay? That means the same side of it will always face the sun. We'll be long gone by then. If we're not, we'll be long gone. That'll be bad. Okay, one side of the Earth is always facing the sun. But did you notice that that's what happens with the moon too? Ever seen the other side of the moon? No, you haven't. Not unless you've been to the other side of it. Okay, because same side of the moon always faces us. It's tidally locked. Okay? And that's usually what happens with a smaller object and a larger object. Okay? Is the smaller one becomes locked and the same face always faces it. All right, so I got sidetracked there. I'm a physics guy, I get going on stuff like that, sorry. Okay, so evolution stuff. Okay, so back to these multicellular organisms, they're getting all kinds of the resources they need because there's all this input of material. Okay, meteors are still hitting the Earth fairly regularly. There's a lot more of them then. Okay, and we're starting to get our first, kind of mats of organisms. Okay, that are living near the ocean and things like that. It wasn't like life didn't come onto land for a long, long time. And the first organisms that would have been on land would have been plants, let's say 700 million years ago. Okay? So life on land isn't that old. Okay? Life in the ocean, very old, but life on land, quite a bit different. There's a lot more challenges to living on land, most of them having to do with lack of water. Okay? But you have to be adapted to that. And so it took a long time for organisms to evolve to the point where they could survive away from the water. Okay? Plants and animals, right? And first, kind of fish kind of crawled out of the ocean, became amphibians and so on. Okay? That took a long time to adapt to that kind of situation. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples here of specialized cells within a plant. I'm never going to test you on these, but I want to look at them in terms of their examples of specialization. So the first ones, believe it or not, are what we call parenchyma cells or stem cells. I think most people have heard that term before, stem cells. Okay, so stem cells are cells that are actually, they start out unspecialized. They can become anything. Okay, they can become anything. What determines what they become is basically kind of a chemical messenger. You see this more in plants than you do in animals, but stem cells can essentially become anything. So if your body needs more skin cells, stem cells could become skin cells, okay? Things like that. So even though they're unspecialized, they're still a special kind of cell. They have a certain job, and that is to replace other types of cells, okay? Because they can become anything. Now, you guys have probably heard of stem cells in the kind of topic of like stem cell research, okay? Like being able to grow tissue and stuff like that. Okay, there's different kinds of stem cells that are used for that. Okay, the kind that the church is opposed to are embryonic stem cells. Okay, embryonic stem cells come from exactly where you think they come from, an embryo. Okay, and that's why the church has a problem with embryonic stem cell research. In order to use embryonic stem cells, you have to harvest them from an embryo. So when you are an embryo, you don't really have a shape yet. Okay? And in this ball of cells, okay, are stem cells, embryonic stem cells. And as you develop, those cells become different groups of cells. They become different tissues. Okay? Some of those cells are destined to become your nervous system. So they'll become your brain and spinal cord. Okay? Some of them are destined to become your digestive tract, your liver, okay? Your stomach, your intestines. Some of them are destined to become your skeletal muscles, your bones, okay? All of that kind of stuff. We have done so much research on embryonic development that we know exactly in an embryo at the 64 cell stage and the 128 cell stage and so on. We know what each one of those cells is going to become, okay? Because we've done enough kind of following embryonic development to know. So the research for embryonic stem cells says, I'm going to take this cell out of the embryo and I'm going to culture it. That means I'm going to put it somewhere where it will divide and it'll continue to grow. And what I'll get from that cell is that particular tissue. So let's say I take the cell that's going to become the embryo's pancreas. Take that out, I put it on a dish, and I grow it. Okay? Eventually, I'm going to have pancreas tissue. I'm not going to grow a pancreas. Okay? Like it doesn't work that way. Okay? But I will grow tissue that is made of pancreatic cells. Right? Now, what can I do with that? Exactly. I can transplant that onto somebody whose pancreas doesn't work. Okay? So if I take a healthy embryo, I take the pancreatic cells from it, I culture it, I grow pancreatic tissue, I can graft that pancreatic tissue onto, let's say, a diabetic person's pancreas. That would effectively cure their diabetes because they would now have cells on their pancreas capable of making insulin. Okay? They would effectively be free of having to take shots anymore or anything like that. Okay? Now, lots of people are like, that's great, that's awesome research, that's a huge deal. Okay? And it is. But it's also a huge deal to what? The embryo. I just took its pancreas. It's dead. Embryonic stem cells come at that cost. Okay? I have fertilized an ovum, I have allowed it to develop, and then I've killed it. Okay? That's the problem that the church has with it. Okay? The church believes life begins at the moment of conception. Okay? When sperm meets egg, that's when life begins. Okay? Because at that point, there's a good scientific reason for the church to believe that. At that point, all the genetic potential for you is there. Okay? That is when you begin as a person. Okay? That's the church's feeling, because all of your genetic material, all the genes from mom, all the genes from dad, have combined into one cell. That's you. That's the church's belief. That's why they have a problem with embryonic stem cell research. They believe that doing that is killing a person. Right? Not everyone believes that, and there's lots of differences of opinion on that, but that's the church's take on that. That's why the church doesn't like embryonic stem cell research. They equate it to abortion, okay, which we also, as Catholics, have a problem with, okay, because we believe life begins at the moment of conception. Okay, that sort of makes sense? That's the argument for it. You can make your own decision on whether you agree with that or not. I'm just telling you that's the reason the church thinks that way. Okay? Now, there's other kinds of stem cells other than embryonic. Okay? There are what we call pluripotent. Yes, pluripotent stem cells in your body. Okay? Even as an adult, you have these. Okay? And they can also be used to grow tissue, but they're not nearly as good as an embryonic stem cell for growing specific tissue. Okay? They can be used for growing connective tissue, really. Okay? I know for a while I was looking into having a procedure done where they would take some fat cells, actually do like a liposuction, okay? And then they would centrifuge these cells, because they would contain pluripotent stem cells, and then they would inject them into my knees. And those pluripotent stem cells would regrow the cartilage that I've destroyed in my knees, okay? Essentially not making it that I wouldn't need a knee replacement, okay? Because I'd be able to regrow healthy cartilage tissue. Okay? That sort of makes sense? Okay? So you have these cells in your body, but I can't get a liposuction and go, here, I want to donate this, grow somebody a pancreas with it. It won't work that way. It's not like that, okay? But it can help to regrow certain kinds of tissue, okay? But stem cells are present in all organisms, and they're unspecialized until they receive the signal that says become this. And if they can, they will. Okay, so that's parenchyma cells in a plant. Okay, water conducting cells. Okay, so there are cells that make up the water conducting tubes in a plant. Okay, they are very different than the cells that make up the flower or the leaf. Okay, they're still generally a plant cell, but they look different. Okay, they're specialized to have really rigid cell walls that create a tight seal, okay, so that water can't escape, and they essentially make a tubular shape so that water can pass through. Okay. All right, food conducting cells also look very similar. Okay, they become tubular and they allow the sap, okay, to descend from the leaves to the roots, okay, and feed them that way. All right, so again, I'm not going to test you on any of these. I'm just giving you examples of these are some of the specialized cells. The part I am going to test you on is the structure of the leaf. That's our best example of specialization, which is coming up here. Okay, so here's the structure of the leaf. So that picture there on the right should look a little bit familiar from yesterday. Okay, that's the same part of the leaf slide that you were looking at. Okay, and what we see here is the best example of specialization in Science 10. Within the leaf, there are a number of different kinds of cells, each one with a specific job. Okay? So what you're going to need to do is know these different types of cells and what their jobs are as an exemplar of specialization in a multicellular organism. Okay? So you're really going to need to know these layers here. All right, so within the leaf, okay, we'll start at the top. Okay? Within the leaf, the top layer of the leaf is made of an epidermis, okay, or epidermal cells. Those epidermal cells secrete the waxy cuticle. That is their only job. They do not carry out photosynthesis. Okay? They do not absorb nutrients. They don't do any of that. They just secrete the waxy cuticle. Right? I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this, but the surface of a leaf has kind of a waxy texture to it. If water lands on it, it beads and runs off. Okay? Water is not absorbed through the leaf of a plant, okay? Because it's covered with this waxy cuticle. Right? The purpose of the waxy cuticle is the same as like chapstick. Okay? If you've ever used like kind of wax-based lip balm, okay? It seals the moisture in. Right? It doesn't allow the moisture to escape. That's what the waxy cuticle does. It seals the leaf so that moisture cannot escape. Moisture can't get in either, but that's okay. The leaf's not supposed to absorb moisture. The roots do that. Okay? They're the other example of specialized tissue. Okay? So this epidermal layer of cells that's actually on the top and the bottom of the leaf, okay, secrete the waxy cuticle. That is their specialized job. Okay, underneath that is the layer that we looked at yesterday, the palisade layer. Okay, where we have just, kind of perfect square rectangular plant cells. Okay? The palisade layer is very, very dense. Lots and lots of cells are packed really, really close together. And every one of those cells was really full of what? What organelle did they have lots of? Chloroplasts, yeah. This is the photosynthetic part of the leaf. Okay? Sure, other parts of the leaf carry out a little bit of photosynthesis, but this is the primary layer for photosynthesis. Okay? It's also why it's on the top. That's the part of the leaf that gets the sun. Okay? So the palisade layer is on the sun-exposed side, okay, on the top, and its job is just to carry out photosynthesis. Those cells don't do anything else. Okay? They carry out photosynthesis, and other cells supply them with everything they need. Okay. Underneath the palisade layer, the cells look quite a bit different. So they go from being all kind of columnar to being very irregular shaped. Okay, so the layer underneath here, okay, they're all very irregular in shape. You can see that in both the diagram and in the picture here. Okay, this is the spongy layer. Okay, and it's called that because it's got gaps in it. Okay, empty spaces, just like a sponge does. Okay, and it holds water and carbon dioxide in it, in those gaps. Okay, so it is essentially just like a sponge. Okay, and its role is to help exchange the gases, that is, transport carbon dioxide to the palisade layer and take the oxygen that it produces away, okay, and allow it to leave the leaf. Okay, that's why it's got all this fluid in there, all this water and stuff like that. That allows that exchange of gases to happen more readily, okay, and so that's all that the spongy layer does. It carries out a little bit of photosynthesis, but mostly its job is just to provide an area where exchange can occur quickly. Okay, and that's why those cells are shaped differently than the palisade cells. Okay, so are we seeing here how specialization also alters the shape of the cell? Okay, a certain shape does a certain job better. All right, underneath the palisade, or underneath the spongy layer, okay, we got those air spaces. Then we've got our transport tissue. Okay, you've got your vein. All leaves have a vein made up of a xylem and a phloem, which we'll talk about later. Okay, and then underneath the spongy layer is another epidermal layer. In that epidermal layer are really special cells, okay, called guard cells. Okay, those guard cells make up what's called a stomate. Okay, so these are really a really good example of a specialized cell. Okay, so the guard cells alter their shape throughout the day. Okay, and by altering their shape, they open and close the stomates. So if you were looking at a stomate, it would look like a pore, okay? So like the pores on your skin. What happens is in the morning, when there's lots of water available, the guard cells' vacuoles are really, really full. So full that they push against the cell wall so hard that it makes the cell, instead of being rectangular, bean-shaped, okay? And when it does that, the stomate is open. Throughout the day, as water evaporates out of the leaf, salts start to build up around the guard cells. Okay? Now, if there's salt around the guard cells, what cell transport process that we talked about is going to happen? Osmosis. Okay? Remember that osmosis is the movement of water across a membrane to balance salt. So suddenly there's more salt outside of the guard cells than inside. Okay? So water starts to move out of their vacuoles and towards the salt. When it does that, they can't maintain that bean shape anymore. They become flatter until the stomate closes. Okay? So the stomate naturally opens and closes based on how much water the plant has lost or gained. Okay? So they're naturally evolved and specialized to change shape by osmosis throughout the day to regulate the amount of water the plant can lose. Okay? So the plant naturally kind of gets to a point where it's like, okay, I'm starting to get thirsty, like dehydrated, so I got to close my stomate so I don't lose any more water. Okay? It would be effectively the same as us going, I'm getting dehydrated, I can't sweat anymore. Okay? Except we couldn't do that, we'd die. Okay? But the plant can do that, it just stops. Okay? Now, once that stops, it also can't carry out what process anymore? What's supposed to be going in and out of the stomates besides water? Carbon dioxide and oxygen are supposed to be exchanged through there. So if we're not exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen anymore, the plant's not carrying out photosynthesis anymore. So once those stomates close, the plant's not carrying out photosynthesis anymore either. Okay? All right, so those are the ones that you'll need to know. You'll need to know the guard cells, okay, and how they make up a stomate, how a stomate works. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the future here, okay? You'll need to know the palisade layer, the spongy layer, the epidermis, waxy cuticle, okay? That's examples of specialized cells within a plant, okay? There's always a question on the unit exam asking you to explain, using the layers of the leaf as an example, how multicellular organisms have specialization, okay? All right, questions on that one? All right, so that's just another diagram of it. It's not as good as the first one, okay, but same layers. Okay, so here's the thing I was trying to explain with my hands, okay? This is the diagram of it. So these are guard cells, okay? So on each side here, this is a guard cell and this is a guard cell, okay? When there's lots of water, they have that bean shape, and then throughout the day, as salts start to build up around the cell, water starts to move out of the cells, okay, by osmosis, and when that happens, so you can see that here, water is leaving, okay, they change their shape and the stomate closes, okay, and that results then in cutting off any water loss, but also cutting off photosynthesis. Okay. Right, so make sure you can explain how a stomate works. So this slide right here in your notes, that paragraph, okay, make sure that you can explain. That is how a plant regulates water loss. There's always a question about that. Okay, the other way a plant regulates water loss, or not so much regulates it, but stops it, okay, is that waxy cuticle. Okay, the fact that the leaves are covered in wax, okay, helps the plant to prevent evaporation from happening from everywhere, only allowing it to happen out the stomates. This is what those guard cells look like under a microscope. If we were looking at the surface of a leaf, we'd be able to actually see them like that. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to get those questions answered. Okay, you probably need a couple of sentences for some of them. Right, so I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll go through them together and we'll clean off our desks.